Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your interest in my topic. My work focuses on the solidarity between indigenous peoples in North America in support of Palestinians. While research on antisemitism has, in recent years, rightly placed greater emphasis on post-colonial studies, indigenous perspectives have thus far been largely overlooked. I am interested in why many indigenous people identify with Palestinians and what discursive and political consequences this has. Using a case study, I'll analyze perceptions of Israel, perceptions of Palestinians, indigenous self-perceptions, and perceptions of Jewish people, and then I'll discuss the resulting political implications. A November 2023 episode of Native America Calling, broadcast just a few weeks after October 7, serves as a case study. The program is intended as a forum for indigenous perspectives on current issues and therefore offers an insightful, focused look at indigenous interpretations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I have observed in the discourse. The image of Israel portrayed by the indigenous participants in the discussion can be divided into four levels of analysis. Israel is a settler colonial state. Israel is a military power of oppression. Israel is a genocidal actor. And there must be a ceasefire. The images of the Palestinians contrast sharply with those of Israel. In contrast to Israel, the colonial power, the Palestinians are viewed as the indigenous population. In the case study, this is less evident than in general discourse, but the Palestinians are portrayed as resistance fighters against Israeli oppression, with a purpose of liberation and the goal of an anti-colonial future. It is certainly emphasized that there is a possible solution to the conflict that does not involve the eradication of Jewish life in the region. However, no specific solution is named. According to the indigenous participants in the discussion, the explanation for this alleged state of affairs lies in Zionism and media coverage, which together obscure the whole picture. I understand this as a closed Manichaean worldview in which roles are clearly defined. Israel is viewed in an entirely negative light, while the Palestinians are viewed in an overwhelmingly positive light. We are familiar with these characterizations from post-colonial perspectives on Israel. What is now intriguing is how the indigenous people explain why they share this perspective. Their solidarity with the Palestinians stems from indigenous values and spirituality. And from the oversimplified equation of the Palestinians with themselves as indigenous peoples. They draw formal comparisons between the situation of indigenous peoples in North America and that of the Palestinians, thereby overlooking significant substantive differences that preclude such a comparison. When the participants speak, they sound noticeably tense and emotionally charged. Their voices convey a mix of grief, resignation, but also anger and resistance. The sight of Gaza evokes in them associations with personal or generational trauma stemming from the colonial experience, which is explicitly described as emotionally unsettling and difficult to bear. From this emotional experience, too, conclusions are drawn that virtually impose indigenous activism for Palestinians. The Jewish never again becomes an indigenous never again, which is then transferred to the Palestinians. Empowerment is an important aspect of indigenous life. And there's a belief that one can influence geopolitics, quote unquote, from within the reservation. The indigenous perspective is that the United States occupies stolen indigenous land and unlawfully appropriates its resources. If these resources are used for military purposes, this directly affects indigenous peoples from their perspective. If their resources are allegedly used to commit genocide, this affects them particularly deeply given their own experience of oppression. Indigenous solidarity with the Palestinians and their stance against Israel are based on these points. Combined with a closed worldview, this results in a rigid stance towards the conflict that leaves no room for other interpretations. Interestingly, the stance is quite open towards Jewish people. The Shoah is clearly identified as a genocidal, horrible Jewish experience, which gives rise to sympathy for Jewish people, because it builds a bridge to the history of indigenous people's persecution. However, this sympathy remains at this level. It cannot be extended to the Jewish state because the state of Israel is already fully cognitively occupied. Oh, I just noticed I'm one page ahead. The worldview remains coherent because a clear distinction is made between Jews and Israelis. While Jewish values are upheld, particularly by a participant who is both indigenous and Jewish, notions of Israelis who are oblivious to the world dominate, if there are any personal attributions at all. This image of Israel further reinforces the Manichaean worldview and the perceived need for solidarity with Palestinians, while at the same time absolving oneself from antisemitism and hatred of Jews. It's been difficult for me to find clear evidence of overt antisemitism, but as I have attempted to show, the material contains statements that I would classify as Israel-related antisemitism. Furthermore, there are interpretative frameworks for explaining the conflict that are reminiscent of conspiracy theories and left-wing anti-Semitic arguments. For example, when economic interests are portrayed as the central cause of the conflict. The very act of equating the experiences of Palestinians and indigenous peoples has direct political implications for how they talk about and address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially since this equation is so emotionally charged that it leads to a high degree of moral certainty and little openness to alternative interpretations of the conflict. Former similarities with the Jewish experience seem to have significantly less emotional impact on indigenous people. They are cognitively aware of the Shoah and of anti-Semitism, but their hearts beat for the Palestinians. The Jewish experience of genocide is often invoked to mirror the colonial experience of indigenous peoples and to lend greater weight to arguments regarding it. I therefore interpret this reference as partly instrumental. BDS is viewed as an effective means of countering Israel's economic influence and thereby of liberating Palestinians. Indigenous people participate in solidarity events, activists seek to exert political influence and bring the supposed intertwining of indigenous and Palestinian experience into the public consciousness. Well, in my view, it has long since taken root. Perhaps you've already seen these illustrations. In online forums and in academic research, the comparability of indigenous peoples and Palestinians is generally discussed in affirmative terms. In closing, I would like to reiterate why I consider the indigenous perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be so important. Indigenous activism is not merely fueled by prevailing anti-Israeli sentiments. It also injects its own dynamic into the discourse. It provides additional arguments to support existing anti-Israeli discourses. When indigenous people themselves say that Palestinians have an indigenous right to the territory, the authenticity of the position as speakers reinforces the argument. With rising attention to indigenous matters beyond romanticized notions of indigenous peoples, which I observe at least in Germany, where I'm from, this may influence the discourse for years to come. Recognizing Palestinians as an indigenous people implies not only the controversial right of return, but also a shared decolonial or anti-colonial project in which a neat distinction is drawn between oppressors and the oppressed. My criticism is not directed at the concerns of indigenous liberation movements. On the contrary, the historical and ongoing discrimination, as well as the often deadly violence to which indigenous communities are subjected until today, are beyond question to me. My criticism is directed at an ideological imbalance that manifests itself in both discourse and action concerning Israel. This case study is representative of a widespread discourse in which Jewish and Israeli perspectives are largely ignored unless they support the indigenous or post-colonial perspective in some capacity. It is precisely this dynamic that I consider an important subject for future research. Thank you.